I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 59 of EO Radio Show. This is our 7th in a series of quick tip episodes focusing on the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. In episode 38, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the states most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. Episode 40 focused on filings in Nevada and Arizona. 43 looked at Washington State and Oregon. 47 addressed Alaska and Hawaii. Episode 52 looked at New York and New Jersey. And most recently, episode 55 looked at Massachusetts and Connecticut. With the help of Joe Hilliard, today we look at the basic state filing requirements for nonprofit corporations operating in Maine and Vermont. We'll work our way through the rest of the states in future episodes. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. As we discussed in previous episode, nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entities. Others include partnerships and limited liability companies. The laws of all the states prescribe certain formalities that organizers of these business entities must go through so that the entity can be regulated and subject to legal process as a person. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like natural persons. This is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the laws, they have to provide notice as to the legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate organization laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information, which may vary state to state. In this episode, we aren't going to dive deep into the pros and cons for where to incorporate, but instead we are focusing on the ease of formation, standardized documents that are available, filing fees, and similar matters. As with all the states we have discussed, if you do business as a nonprofit in Maine or Vermont, or solicit charitable contributions there, even if just through the nonprofit corporation's website, the nonprofit may need to have a legal presence and be registered in these two states. For the details on the states, I'm happy to welcome back Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella. He specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities, and in particular, charities that are tax-exempt under Internal Revenue Code 501c3. Prior to working at Farella, he worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate purchases and vendor contracting. Welcome back, Joe.
Hi, it's good to be here again.
So let's start with Maine. How does the nonprofit corporation form in Maine or register there if they're a foreign corporation?
For sure. So the Secretary of State's Bureau of Corporations, Elections, and Commissions is what governs Maine entity formations. They do, as we've talked about a lot of these, have a form articles of incorporation for your domestic nonprofit. It's a 3-page form, and it's basically a blank space fill-in for most of the articles. Some of the specifics, the second article allows you to check as a public benefit or a mutual benefit under Maine law, and then has a fill-in portion for the specific purpose. The fifth article notes that there are what your number of directors will be, and it needs to be at least 3 here in Maine. The seventh article is a checkbox to note legislative influence / political campaign related engagements. And the 8th article is a checkbox to call out language for the nonprofit IRS required distribution provisions language that we've talked about on more than one occasion here. And then you can note to that you add an exhibit with the specific language details beyond that. So it's nice in that, like I said, it has a checkbox, but then it says, okay, and then attach this for that to get it for you. It's a very, very simple, easy form.
Quick question there. They ask for the number of directors. It has to be stated.
Yes, it asks for the number. Interestingly, unlike a lot of our East Coast foray here, it's just going to ask for the number here in the initial formation document. It won't be until the annual filing that we see the names and addresses. And the same with as we go into the foreign application here, they don't ask for the officer names here, not until a year into what you've actually done to when you've started to do your annual reports.
So the reason I bring that up, it was an issue for another client this past week that their articles listed the number of directors, but for many years they'd been operating, this particular client, with a different number of directors. So it's just a flag to note for organizations that list the number, you're kind of stuck with it.
You need to be consistent. We haven't really talked about amendments so much on these, but just like we amend when we change certain bylaws or we change certain underlying issues with the foundation, this is something that you would file and amended to your articles to say, hey, I now have a different board number to that.
For many organizations is a big deal because they'll often amend the bylaws or just simply decide they need a different number of directors. But if it's in your articles, it's a bigger deal because it's more difficult to amend that. But anyway, I digress. I just noticed that because it's a little bit different. We don't often see the required number of directors in the articles. Okay, so sorry, I knocked you off your outline, but moving on to the foreign nonprofit. Yeah, it's conversational, right?
It's good. It's good to keep in mind. Like I said, a lot of these things you don't think about until they come up. So
right, exactly. Yeah, the foreign nonprofit. What does the foreign nonprofit that's doing business or soliciting in Maine need to do to get itself compliant with the basic registration?
So here, this is just a 2-page form, and it's called the Application for Authority to Carry On Activities. It asks just basics, your state of incorporation, the name to be used, and if it's not available there in Maine, what you're going to use as your alternative as a state-level DBA, your purpose, whether you're going to engage in activities under Maine law, with a carve-out that if it's not specifically under Maine law, which is something to consult with local Maine counsel on, obviously, if you are doing business there, to see what exactly that would entail. I don't think there's much of a difference in the carve-out, but obviously the state thinks something of this to ask you that.
Filing fee costs.
For the domestic articles, it's $40, and for the foreign authority, it's $45. Very reasonable.
And is it a quick turnaround? It's all on the website?
Right now, on the nonprofits FAQ part of the Maine Secretary of State website, and this was as of last week, October 12th, they have a backlog, and the anticipated processing time without expediting is 25 to 30 business days, which would, in real time, would be close to 2 months. They do have expedite available. It's $50 for within 24 hours and $100 for an immediate filing. And with the $40 that you were talking about for the 40 or 45 for the filing, that's still fairly reasonable. You're still talking less than $150 even for an immediate filing fee there. So it may be worth it to think about that, to do that, especially like now we're talking about if you want to. Here we're in October. If you want to form something in Maine before the end of the year, unless you expedited, you probably wouldn't get your confirmation until the New Year's almost.
Pretty long turnaround time. That's unusual. So transparency, what needs to be disclosed in the Maine corporate filings?
So we discussed briefly there although when you file your initial articles in your foreign application, you don't have to refer to your officers or your directors. When you do the annual reports, they will require names and business or residence addresses. It's an either or for your president, the treasurer, the registered agent, the secretary/clerk. They have a sort of a different terminology there in Maine for some of the positions in the corporate, and then all of your directors as well.
When are these filings due? What's the reporting cycle for the annual reports in Maine?
Irrespective of when you are formed or when you registered, June 1st of every year is the due date for your annual report there. It's relatively simple. It's closer to what we see in Delaware, where we've got just a one date fits all versus states like where we've talked about California, where it's tied to your actual formation date. So it's actually very simple there.
Yeah, that does sound more straightforward. And it looks like the annual fee is not particularly onerous.
No, it's $35 for both the domestic and for the foreign filings.
And in that annual filing, I presume you update the names and addresses of the officers and the directors and
yes, as
everything
necessary.
Current.
Always make sure that you're current. The state doesn't make a lot from the $35. I think the bigger deal for them is to make sure that they have current information in case there's any sort of an issue.
All right. So any other state agencies in Maine that the nonprofit organization needs to register with?
Well, if you have your office there or if you are soliciting charitable contributions, you will be required to register with the Office of Professional and Occupational Regulation, which is an agency within their Department of Professional and Financial Regulations. This is where most of the states we see this run through the Attorney General's office, but that's where their charitable organizations are run through. And then additionally, if you need state exemptions there in Maine, the nonprofit needs to apply through the Maine Department of Administrative and Financial Services, and then specifically the Revenue Services Branch. an overview of all the Maine requirements from the Maine Association of Nonprofits. They've put one up, and we put the link in the show notes. It's really good. It gives you a whole idea of like breakdowns within even the tax exemptions part in this. So they've actually have a very good nonprofits group going there in Maine that gives you a lot of good information on this backside.
Oh, that's great. That sounds really helpful. So shifting gears to Vermont, looks like we are going to the Secretary of State discussion there for registering in the state of Vermont.
Yes, yeah, their Secretary of State. It's really simple. It goes straight through their Secretary of State website. Interestingly here, we'll talk about this, all filings in Vermont are done online. There are no paper versions of their forms available. So it was kind of interesting because there aren't really sample forms available for viewing. I kind of went through and found some foundations that I knew and looked at their filings as we talk about. These are all public filings, so you can see what was in the most current forms. And looking at these file charities, the domestic articles of incorporation is actually just when it's printed and finalized, one-page document. It just needs to identify a, quote, business description, unquote, which will be the standard purpose we have for our charities that we put like in our 1023 and things. As the space is small, it's recommended to have an additional provision attachment to supply that purpose statement. And the form also asks for benefit type you are, where it's noted like mutual benefit nonprofit corporation as an example. Then any other provisions such as the IRS language we've been talking about will need to be added as an attachment. And at this time, you will need to identify just a single director and or officer on the form, just one contact person in your initial filing. And then for a foreign nonprofit, it's a certificate of authority that's filed online. The only difference between what we've just talked about versus the domestic is that you need to note your fiscal end of the year along with the state formation where you've come from on this. So it's still very simple. Like I said, it's a couple of click boxes, fill-ins, and attachments. So
what are the fees in Vermont?
Both domestic and nonprofit are $125.
Oh, well, okay. Simple. I skipped over the transparency issues.
Here in Vermont, the domestic articles officer and directors need to be identified, and both the foreign and the domestic will need to identify officers and directors in their reporting later, not in the initial filings, much like we just talked about in Maine. Most of these are projected towards your next filing after a year.
Got it. Moving on to the final few things that we cover for each state. What's the processing time look like? And the first question is processing for the first filing. Then the question is the
annual
renewals.
Reports. Yeah. So for your initial registrations, their website notes that online processing time should be less than 1 business day. So
wow. A lot quicker than Maine, huh?
A lot quicker than Maine, yes. The annual filings they're going to be biannual here, but it's kind of interesting. A nonprofit corporation or a nonprofit cooperative corporation in Vermont, you must renew your nonprofit registration every 2 years, but beginning the first year following initial registration by filing your report between January and April. So if we form now in October of 23, our first report will actually be due in 2024, but then the next one, 2026, 2028. So you have the first one is a 1 year and then it's 2 years thereafter. And as noted, these biannual filings will need to name all the principals is what they refer to, which would be your directors and the officers. And again, this is something that's only filed online, and the fees here for your biannual is $20 irrespective of whether you're domestic or foreign.
Okay, great. That wraps up the details for the filings with the Secretary of State's office. Are there any other state agencies in Vermont that supervise the nonprofit charitable organizations?
If you're soliciting charitable, if you have an actual physical office there in Vermont, you register with their attorney general. And again, this is much more common with what we see out here in the West Coast, where the attorney general handles filing, watching and monitoring the charitable organizations. They too have a Vermont-specific online PDF handbook that we're going to link to in the show notes that's very good for when you get to that step of registering with their Attorney General's office. There again, their Department of Taxes handle any tax exemptions you may have that you need to look at.
Yeah, and just one clarification there on the soliciting, the charitable contribution solicitations, that alone doesn't, if the organization has an office in Vermont or Maine, that'll require registration with the Secretary of State. But typically the AG rules come into play if you're soliciting regardless of whether you have an office.
Yes, that's correct. I'm sorry. I didn't realize I read that as an and. It's an either or. Yes.
Yeah, it's an either or. Yeah. So if you're soliciting from your website and it's specific to Vermont or Maine, in either case, the AG registration may be required in Vermont and the Maine Office of Professional and Occupational Regulation in that case. So for organizations that are soliciting throughout the country, these 2 states are definitely going to want to know about it. Anything else to cover from Maine and Vermont? They seem pretty straightforward by comparison to some of the ones we've talked about lately.
No, these were actually very simple, very straightforward, easy to register in states. I think we covered everybody.
Yet again, annual report dates. Everybody wants to be a little different. Thanks a lot, Joe. Thanks for putting together all the show notes and the links, and all the resources in the show notes are just terrific. Thanks again for that.
For sure. Good to be here again.
So that's all for this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to resources in Maine and Vermont and links to earlier episodes on the states we've already covered. Also, Farella, Braun, and Martel now has a YouTube channel, and there are several nonprofit playlists that organize these episodes, including one we are building with all the state filing episodes, so they're all in one place on that YouTube channel. So look for that link in the show notes as well. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun, and Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.